This is a concept which was formulated back in, I believe, 2018 or 2019 by a couple of excellent legal scholars in the US. And it's an idea called the liar's dividend, which is essentially when everything can be faked, everything could be fake, right? And so you essentially just inject into an already pretty shaky information ecosystem plausible deniability for any piece of authentic media to be dismissed as fake, as AI generated, as a deep fake. And this is something that we've seen actually up until fairly recently as a much bigger problem than deepfakes directly themselves and generative AI directly itself. So the liar's dividend is something which I think we'll see more and more. I imagine we'll see it in the US elections next year. I imagine it may come to the UK in our potentially late 2024, early 2025 elections, and is increasingly part of everyday life. Because if something's inconvenient now, it doesn't have to be something which you accept.
Welcome to Freedom Matters, where we explore the intersection of technology, productivity, and digital well-being. I'm your host, Georgie Powell, and each episode we'll be talking to experts in productivity and digital wellness. We'll be sharing their experiences on how to take back control of technology. We hope you leave feeling inspired, so let's get to it. This week, I'm in conversation with Henry Ajder. Henry is a globally recognised advisor, speaker and broadcaster working at the frontier of the generative AI and synthetic media revolution. He has led pioneering research at organisations including MIT, Witness and Sensity AI, influencing international legislation and corporate AI strategy. A deepfake cartographer, Henry's work has mapped the emergence and evolution of generative technologies and the impact that they have on our lives. Today we'll be discussing the current fear around how these technologies are evolving, many of the use cases and impacts of generative AI, and what users can do to ensure that they use these tools in a productive and reliable way. I love this conversation with an expert who is so close to how generative AI is exponentially accelerating. It was an important wake-up call to remind me to stay conscious of the role of technology in my life and the questions that we need to keep asking. I hope it gets you thinking too. Henry, welcome to the Freedom Matters podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's really great to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to hopefully an interesting conversation.
Over the past few months, a number of incredibly influential people in the tech industry have taken a stand against the rate at which AI is evolving. When we recorded this podcast, Geoffrey Hinton, seen to be one of the godfathers of AI, had just quit Google. I wanted to start by asking Henry, why is everyone suddenly so concerned? What's changed?
Yeah, the creators are having a reckoning about what they've created, so to speak. So that was obviously something that the media really picked up on. And before that, there was this open letter signed by the likes of Elon Musk and Max Tegmark and other experts, similarly saying, let's put a 6-month pause on AI development. And that caught the imagination of the public as well. I think what's really changed over the last year or so is accessibility and the kind of democratization or commodification of these technologies. There's a reason that ChatGPT or DALL-E 2 or Stable Diffusion or 11 Labs, which is a voice cloning company, have made such waves compared to, say, the promises of the metaverse for many people. And that's because it's in their hands right now and they can get utility from it, right? It's not a theoretical or early stage technology in terms of access. It is something that you can, with an email address and a password, sign up in a number of minutes and start creating content, writing emails or creating artwork for your presentations or cloning voices for memes on TikTok, right? And the fact that technologies that even 2-3 years ago were incredibly restricted. I remember the wait list for the GPT-3 API, the code to be able to access that tool set, being really hard to get a hold of and being very limited. Whereas now, of course, with ChatGPT, you have a much more powerful model which anyone can access. So I think accessibility has been the real shift. And I think the appetite that has now been demonstrated for these tools has led to a snowballing effect where these tools were made much more accessible. Lots of people started using them, which in turn has now driven lots more people to try and build products and services in a similar model, obviously with an eye to building the next big tech titan. I think in terms of the technology itself, we've also seen some pretty big jumps. Now, as mentioned, GPT-3 came out a couple of years ago. And before that, we even had GPT-2, which these were good. They were very impressive for the time, but compared to what we're now seeing with ChatGPT and GPT-4 in particular, as well as some of the other models like Facebook's Llama, for example, they were nowhere near as good. And these models in particular have been really improved by essentially brute force training. That is just more compute, more GPUs, and more data. And so I think we've seen real escalation there, which has led to significant technological change. But then we've also seen novel approaches developed. So again, back in 2017, 2018, it was a technology called autoencoders. Those were the technologies behind the face swapping tools. You might have seen some of the kind of viral videos of celebrities' faces on different characters and so on. Then it was GANs, or generative adversarial networks. These were these tools that could do the "this X does not exist," generating images of non-existent objects or people based on a data set of real people. And now the fusion models in image generation have really taken over and provided a fine-grained level of control to users that wasn't previously possible. So with the "this X does not exist," "this cat does not exist," "this person does not exist," you couldn't really fine-tune the color of the hair of that person or the size of that cat or the breed of the cat, whatever. You just have to deal with the output that it spat out for you. Whereas now, a lot of these tools are incredibly customizable, and that's because of these real breakthroughs with the technology. So I think accessibility and leaps in technology itself have been the key contributors.
And so what's next? Does this technology just keep accelerating by amassing more and more data?
There are some interesting questions now being raised about how much data is there left to scrape. And we're talking about GPT-4 probably being trained on trillions of words, right? And scraping most of the internet to get that data. We're seeing folks like Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, and Emad Mostak, the CEO of Stability, saying actually the future of these models is not going to be about these massive brute force, massive compute, massive data jumps. It's now going to be much more about fine-tuning the existing pre-trained models, all of the existing models, to make them better at things like, for example, numerical reasoning or common sense capabilities that a lot of these models at the moment still lack. I think obviously there are some really interesting questions, some that maybe your listeners in particular are considering when it comes to things like privacy online and so on, about how the data that has been used to train these models has been obtained, and whether the law is now fit for purpose to capture a new age of copyright with AI. Because a lot of these companies are claiming that they've not broken any laws, they are not copying, they are essentially deriving, in a sense, something which is a synthesis of all of these discrete inputs. Whereas obviously if you're an artist and you can see your style being copied almost exactly to generate novel artworks based on data of your original artworks, I think it's quite easy to see why you might be concerned or think that the law should be protecting you better.
What I think is also really interesting, and this for me the biggest takeaway from the AI dilemma, which Tristan Harris and Asa Raskin publicised, and they're talking about where they thought we were at from a kind of AI risks perspective. And I guess this is what Sam's also talking about when they talk about the fine-tuning of these large-scale models, is how the technology is shifting from being something which is just really good and effective at creating content and holding our attention, because AI models have done that for ages and they've been driving engagement, to now something which is incredibly intimate. And so it's using this data on a large scale to talk directly to us as an individual in the way that we want to be spoken to, and that is unique to each of us. And I'm really interested in that dimension. Is that something you also consider to be such a sort of significant risk?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think with a lot of these, particularly when we're talking about text-based models, right, when we're talking about conversational chatbots, there is a tendency of a lot of these chatbots to hallucinate, as they say, to confidently make up falsehoods or almost arrogantly assert things as if they were real when they're not. And I guess an extension of that is that these models can also be quite, I guess you could say, sycophantic. They are trained in a certain way where they are essentially looking to appease a human reviewer in that regard. And I think that is something that kind of, I guess, on one level worries me, is that if you've got models which are not necessarily optimized for the truth as such, but they're optimized to say what they think you want to hear, that's not necessarily very good. And obviously you can see how that could be weaponized, particularly as we see the open source community around language models really explode, and people pre-training language models much cheaper way than even 6 months ago you could. What that opens up in terms of potential for highly personalized chatbots for, let's say, certain political ideologies, or certain individuals even that you want to try and have as your chatbots. You can imagine certain people wanting to have a celebrity as their best friend, but it's not necessarily how the celebrity actually is, it's how they want them to be. And so I think we'll see increasingly not just the big four companies releasing their chatbots, but we're seeing people actively trading and sharing incredibly custom chatbot. I think that will really heighten that issue, that these models are incredibly tailored, intimate to us. We can feed into it whatever we want and are ultimately designed, as we saw recently with the model released from Mustafa Suleyman, one of the co-founders of DeepMind, Reid Hoffman, the co-founder of LinkedIn, as an empathetic conversational chatbot. I can't remember the name of the company. I think it's Inception AI, I think. This idea that AI can be more flattering, it can seem empathetic, it can seem more human, ironically, in some respects, or more has a bit of bedside manner. These kinds of things I think are quite worrying to me, because we are, as humans, we desperately try to anthropomorphize things. And many times we do that to things which aren't that close to humans anyway. Whereas with the capabilities of these bots, I don't think it's hard to understand why people do anthropomorphize. That's a hard word to say. Anthropomorphize these chatbots, and what that means again for kind of human relationships. We've seen this with a chatbot called Replica, which was framed as your AI companion, but very quickly was starting to be optimized and trained in a way which then sort of added in an intimacy dynamic. When they removed that update from the chatbot, they had a massive backlash from people who had built these kind of romantic relationships in a sense with their chatbot, and they ended up going back on it because of the amount of backlash they had. So it's really, that example is like the film Her, right, with Joaquin Phoenix and Scarlett Johansson. So I think the
And
short
there's a Snapchat case study that I keep coming back to as well. I found absolutely shocking. These are set up to basically catch the chatbot that's in Snapchat.
My AI,
Supporting a 13-year-old going to meet up with a 40-year-old or something for their
right,
birthday to have sex for their first time. The chatbot's telling them that they should use candles.
right, and it's pretty awful when you see these things. And by the same token, there was a case in, I believe it was in Belgium, where someone killed themselves based on conversations they had with a conversational chatbot, which essentially had led him to that decision and kind of encouraged it. So it's really, there are a lot of cases where you get incredibly seamless conversations, right, that feel very real, and it's like magic. And then you get these cases where almost like you get a glitch in the matrix with these models, and will say something which is just completely wrong or completely odd, or in many cases, completely inappropriate and potentially harmful. And I think that for me is the concern as well, is that it's not just about the personalization that these bots or these chatbots or large language models can provide. It's the asymmetry between what they actually can do and what people believe they can do. And there's a certain reliance, I think, on these tools, and a certain tendency, again, to treat them as almost godlike technologies that can do anything and everything, when they're far from robust, as we'd say, in the AI space. And they're not particularly well aligned right now with human values, human motivations, so to speak. And that's just on the chatbot side of things. Obviously, there are massive issues around bias in data sets. For example, when it comes to image generation, type in a prompt, CEO at a desk talking to his assistant, and you're more likely to get a male CEO with a female assistant, for example, even less likely to get, for example, a black female CEO. And there are interesting ethical questions which are quite difficult on one level, saying if most of the pictures of CEOs in the world out there are white men, then chances are, if it's making that representation, it's representing the world as it is. Now, we can say we don't want the world to be like that. We think it ought to be different. But should we be training these models to represent the world as we think it ought to be? Who gets to make that judgment call? And this is something that Elon Musk is an interesting kind of firebrand at the moment for particularly the right. Has been saying he's going to develop, I think it was Truth GPT, to avoid what he saw as right-wing bias, that these models wouldn't say things which were deemed to be acceptable on the right but unacceptable on the left, for example. So there's a lot of questions about what the right way is to release these tools. How do you frame them to the public so that they understand what they can and can't do? How do you introduce robust safety measures that can't be easily circumvented by people kind of role playing as their grandmother or something like this? It's one of the interesting ones I've seen recently. It's a difficult landscape, Georgie. This is all coming in an incredibly short window of time. All of these really big developments. It used to be the case that I could feel pretty on top of the news surrounding generative AI, deepfakes, and so on with a couple of hours of reading and skimming through research papers, articles. Nowadays, I can't cover all of this, even if I spent all day doing it, because there is just so much news. There are so many developments. There are so many products, so many legislative approaches being considered, bad use cases, good use cases. And so the everyday person's got no chance.
It's just, as we're talking, the number of different use cases that are coming up and the consequences of those use cases and then the consequences of those consequences. It's like a game of Go. I just feel like there is just infinite possibilities in terms of the impact that these unbaked or half-baked products will have on our lives. I'm like, where's the comprehensive document?
Yeah,
all the potential ways that these tools are going to be used and then the impacts of those use cases. For me, all the things you talked about are so legitimate and really important. The one I've been more concerned about is how we end up only reading media and content which we want to hear, or the version that we read is written for us in a certain way, and kind of the polarization that causes, but also the narrowing, the echo chamber times a million that we all know is really unhealthy for society and relationships. But we could go on just. And so what's happening? Like, where have we got to? What do you think we need to do to reset? What do you think will happen? It's all rather overwhelming.
It is. It's very overwhelming. And just to your point, Georgie, around information siloing, filter bubbles, echo chambers, I think that is certainly a legitimate concern. It's something that is already an established problem on social media way before generative AI has kind of taken off. And I would agree that these are issues which will be exacerbated. And I think, for me, I worry that distinguishing good signal from the noise is only going to get harder, because there's going to be a lot of noise that looks like a signal, because we're going to have a lot of stuff that plausibly sounds like it was written by a human, audiovisual media that's meant to be informative, which again plausibly looks like it's been authentically captured, which is not. And so really getting to the signal is going to get harder, particularly as we see in a landscape where people are constantly trying to gain SEO for search engines. They're constantly trying to build sort of blog platforms which are fundamentally vacuous in terms of actually useful information, but they're just designed to gain clicks. If you go on Amazon reviews and if you go on Twitter and you search as an AI chatbot, you will see so many reviews and tweets coming up which are reviewing products. But essentially, people have just been too lazy to actually edit the response from the chatbot to get rid of that initial kind of disclaimer. So it really is, right. So it really is seeping into everyday life. And those are the clumsy cases that we can easily track. There are many more. It's tip of the iceberg in terms of the ones which are much more subtly introduced. I'm sure you and many of your listeners have read a piece of media where a journalist has used this technology, an email, a blog post, whatever it may be, and you can't tell. So it's really challenging. And I guess my concern is that this will just lead to a huge flood of generative spam, essentially, which is of a higher quality than the spam we see right now, but is polluting of the information ecosystem. And cleaning that up is going to be, I think, unfortunately, near impossible. But I think it's where trusted news actually becomes more important than ever, which is ironic given that it's constantly under assault by particularly popular politicians around the world.
Where are we? What do we do? What's going to stop this?
So I think one thing I would say is that the coverage of generative AI and indeed deepfakes for a long time has been pretty sensational, right? It's either this is the greatest thing, this is going to revolutionize everything, the hype train has left the station, as I often say, or it's full doomer kind of, this is the end of the world. I do think we should be concerned. I do think there are lots of things that we need to sort out, which we are behind on at the moment. At the same time, I do think that these are tools which legitimately can help people in their day-to-day lives. I'm not ashamed to say that I've used ChatGPT in certain contexts to help rephrase a certain passage which I've written, which I'm like, oh, this sounds clunky. How could I rephrase this? And it's been helpful. In the same context, artists might be able to use text-to-image generators to brainstorm ideas before putting a brush to canvas. So there are loads of use cases which are genuinely exciting. And I think we have to be careful not to be too kind of sucked in by the future shock aspect of it. At the same time, there are big challenges that we need to address. I worry the temptation is that just as people are seeing ChatGPT in terms of these kinds of overstatements of its ability. I similarly worry that people with solution approaches are going to be overly confident in the capabilities, particularly of technological solution approaches. There are two that are worth noting. So one is more traditional, I guess what you call a deepfake detection approach, which is using AI to spot AI. You train an algorithm on a large amount of fake content. It learns to pick up on essentially the digital fingerprints that are left behind on these images that may be imperceptible to the human eye. And then it can give a certain confidence score as to whether an image or a video or an audio track is fake.
Or written content even.
And written content, but it's very unreliable, especially with text. It's just the markers of it are really hard to pick up, particularly again in shorter passages. The longer it runs, typically you start to be able to see something. But I guess the point is, even if these models were to reach 99.9% accuracy, which sounds really good, right? And I can tell you for a fact that we're way off that now for a universal detection system across all of these different mediums, all of these different tools, because remember, the way that Stable Diffusion may generate a synthetic image is going to be different in terms of the way it works.
The recipe.
Midjourney in one sense, yeah. But even if it's 99.9% accurate, the amount of content which is uploaded and shared on social media and in the news and everywhere else online every day, every second, is insane. And even 0.1% of that content being flagged as a false positive or a false negative, particularly if it's in a critical context like an election or in a fraud-based context, right? And people will be optimizing for those contexts because that's where they're really putting in the money and the effort to try and get a return, whether that's political or financial. It can actually do more harm than good because you give people false confidence. They're like, oh, I know this is real because the detection system said it is, or I know this is fake because the detection system said it is. And I've seen this firsthand in Myanmar, where a video of a politician giving a false confession was claimed by the opposition resisting the coup there at the moment to be a deepfake. It wasn't, but I can understand why they were suspicious. It was quite a glitchy video, and they ran it through an online deepfake detection tool, and it said it was fake. And many people still to this day believe that video is not real and that the government is using deepfakes or the army is using deepfakes against them. You can imagine how, in a world where generative content is even more ever present than it is right now, and you have a whole swathe of different supposedly reliable deepfake detection tools, it could just further muddy the water in a way which is really actually more damaging. And then you start to get people saying, this tool's more reliable, this tool's been developed by these people, this tool has these biases, right?
That becomes the police, basically. It's the global police of content.
Right. And I guess it's also worth saying that there are countries out there that I imagine maybe would create their own deepfake detection tools to offer their citizens, which when they find a piece of content which is real but inconvenient for them, they flag it as fake, right? Which is not inconceivable. So yeah, deepfake detection, not very reliable right now, not particularly robust, needs constantly updating to keep up with the technology and could do more harm than good when it gets things wrong. There's another approach, which is content provenance, where you essentially secure the media in a more bottom-up sense rather than a top-down scanning that deepfake detection does. It's a bit like attaching almost like a receipt to an image, in a sense, where at every stage in that image's or that video's lifespan online, people can, let's say, click the three dots in the corner and it can say, this image was taken on this phone or this camera, it was taken at this time, it was using this lens, it was taken by this person, and then at this point it was cropped to remove this, or it had this effect placed on it, and then it was shared here and so on. So you really get like a ledger of where the images or where the videos have been, where they've been manipulated. And this also works for things that were fake from the offset. So you could have AI-generated content, which from the moment it's being generated is flagged as AI-generated by Stable Diffusion, for example. So that approach uses cryptography to secure this information, this metadata to the piece of media. And for me, that's much more promising just because you don't have to have that guessing game. And
no, but in both cases, I guess you have a massive civil education piece that has to go alongside it, which sort of says, whether you're trusting a tool to sort it out for you or whether you're having to look yourself, you still have to ask questions. You still have to go digging. You can't accept anything at face value.
It's a great point, and you're absolutely right, which is there are some big challenges to this as well. And I guess when I say I think it's much better than deepfake detection, that doesn't mean it's perfect or without obstacles. So one of those obstacles, as you mentioned, is education. It's about a mindset change globally, right? That When people think about reflexively liking a tweet that they agree with, you want people to start reflexively clicking those three little buttons, so to speak, to get that data whenever they have a slight suspicion. So that will take a lot of work. That will take a lot of time. You also have baking it into the infrastructure, right? This is only going to work, as I mentioned earlier. You can't put the responsibility on the individual to go and insert this link into this website and then wait for the results and then cross-reference. So it's not going to happen. The friction's too much. So what we really need is for this to get baked into the news platforms, the social media platforms, the camera manufacturers, the mobile phone manufacturers. We really need an end-to-end pipeline. And a lot of this work is actually being pioneered by Adobe and their partners. They're looking to bake this into Photoshop, which I think is quite positive. But we really need all of those partners on board, because if you don't get a critical adoption and you don't get it across society, then you're going to almost have a strange sort of hierarchy of media where legitimate media, which is not using this standard, will be seen as unreliable just because it's not using it, even if it's just not using it because it doesn't have access in that country, or if that individual doesn't have access on that device, for example.
Or it could also be seen as the less friction, like the source with less friction. And therefore, if you can't be bothered to go through the clicks and the extra stages you have to go through when you're viewing content to verify that it is real, you just go to the next source down and say, I just want to watch the news.
Exactly. I think I'd go a step further, and I think this is where the point you made is really great about just still having to be critical, is that it's not just about the friction, it's also about whether you're hearing what you want to hear. And a lot of people may dismiss a technologically watertight piece of software as, again, sponsored by the government, it's rigged against my favorite politicians, because they don't like what they see. And that's a much deeper psychological issue, societal issue, than a technological one. You're not going to be able to fix people's tendency towards post-truth politics via technology. And I think that's the key, is that these systems, they are not truth ometers. They can tell you whether an image has been altered or not. It doesn't tell you whether that image has been staged by that person. It doesn't tell you if it's been framed in a certain way.
Yeah.
Context, exactly. So I think this really leads, I guess, to what I think is at the moment the best chance we have. And I touched on it earlier when saying trusted media is now more important than ever, which is, as it becomes harder for you or I, the critical viewer, to see what is real or what is not when it comes to synthetic content, whether that's reading, listening, watching a show or whatever, it's even more important that we place emphasis on that kind of sift approach, where you stop, inspect, fact check on the content you're viewing or consuming. The problem is, of course, is that the people who need to do that the most are the ones who are most resistant to doing it. Yeah. And again, that's a much deeper societal rot, I think you could say.
Yeah, gosh. So we've talked about sifting and remaining critical. What else can listeners do to stay aware, given where generative AI is currently at? What do you do every day? What are some of the practices that you make sure you apply when you're doing anything?
Well, so I probably do a freedom taboo of having about 120 Chrome tabs open at once and constantly sifting through them, just so that I know the latest models, the latest use cases, the latest startups, legislative moves, and so on. Obviously, not realistic, and I wouldn't encourage your readers or your listeners, to do that. Yeah, no, I think they'll be losing their mind as I am. What I would suggest is there are some really good resources out there which kind of help. And I think even if it's just, for example, one newsletter you subscribe to where you get a weekly digest and you just skim through, I think that's really useful to just understand what is possible. Because again, 12 months ago, a lot of the technologies that are now being put out in the world and gamified and democratized, they didn't even exist. And tomorrow we could see a tool release which completely changes the landscape again. One newsletter I'd really recommend is called Last Week in AI. Mm-hmm. And that's very good, quite long, a lot of content in there, but a really good read and a really good overview. I think the other thing I would say is, as you mentioned, if you're an artist or you're a journalist or you're someone whose role feels either threatened by or certainly disrupted by these technologies, I would really recommend actually giving them a go and getting to know them, because they are going to change the world. They already are. And I think a lot of people are worried about AI replacing people's jobs. And I think the more plausible event right now, the more plausible outcome is more that I think people using AI are going to be more likely to replace people who aren't. And that's because it does add in little efficiencies. It does help change the way you maybe see something or provide you with capabilities that you didn't have before. That's not to say you shouldn't be mindful and thoughtful about how you're using these tools and recognizing the biases and the challenges. But I think these technologies aren't going away. We need to learn to live with them in some form or another, whilst also recognizing and demanding better from the companies and the legislators who are frankly not doing enough to address misuse at the moment.
Fascinating. I feel like we could go on forever. Before we do, I want to wrap, but before we do, I'd love to just tell me some of the hilarious deepfakes that you've seen recently. And also some of the things that you talked about in Myanmar, but I also love the kind of the twist of how, I think was it Elon Musk's shareholders were saying that some of the things that he'd previously said in the past were fake when actually they weren't. So I'd love to hear a couple of examples from both sides.
I'll start with the Elon Musk example because that's quite pernicious, that's quite scary, and then we can end on something a little bit lighter. So this is a concept which was formulated back in, I believe, I think it was either 2018 or 2019 by a couple of excellent legal scholars in the US. And it's an idea called the liar's dividend, which is that essentially when everything can be faked, everything could be fake, right? And so you essentially just inject into an already pretty shaky information ecosystem plausible deniability for any piece of authentic media to be dismissed as fake, as AI generated, as a deep fake. And this is something that we've seen actually up until fairly recently as a much bigger problem than deepfakes directly themselves and generative AI directly itself. People dismissing, again, in political contexts, opposition's campaign videos as deepfakes. Trump famously with the Hollywood Access tape. We saw with the January 6th riots, or the rioters, two of the defendants claimed that the footage of them that was being used in the case could have been a deepfake. And as you noted, Elon Musk's lawyers recently said that Elon's a very popular figure. He's often deepfaked. This audio of him talking about self-driving capabilities of Teslas could also be a deepfake, which was a key point of evidence in a civil trial against him. And the judge basically said, this is a very concerning objection you're raising because this is really dangerous. So the liar's dividend is something which I think we'll see more and more. I imagine we'll see it in the US elections next year. I imagine it may come to the UK in our potentially late 2024, early 2025 elections, and is increasingly part of everyday life. Because if something's inconvenient now, it doesn't have to be something which you accept, particularly if it's something which is potentially criminal, as we've seen in certain cases. So very concerning. Memes, though, can be great. And indeed, I wrote a report for the human rights organization Witness and MIT on deepfakes in the context of satire and the politics of synthetic media. And there are some fantastic deepfakes out there, which are clearly fake, clearly fun. My favorite one recently is there is a YouTuber who is creating let's play style videos, that is people playing games online. But instead of it being some kids in their bedrooms shouting at each other, it's Trump, Biden, Obama, and Hillary Clinton. And it's them playing Minecraft, shouting at each other about stealing their sword or whatever. And it's ridiculous, really funny though. There's another one for Mario Party, which is great.
Where do you find these?
So they've become a massive trend on TikTok, but you can also find them on YouTube. And indeed, it's worth mentioning that the origins of deepfakes sadly was in non-consensual pornography, which is something we haven't discussed here, but is a huge problem affecting almost exclusively women. But at the same time, we also saw some of the earliest cases being Nicolas Cage's face swapped onto Lois Lane in Superman, or Mr. Bean in a Christian Dior advert on this beautiful model. And there is a lot of very silly, very funny content here. But it also has its double-edged sword, because the same audio tool for creating that deepfake and creating that funny meme could be used by a bad actor to make Trump say something really bad, or Biden or others. So we are really talking about dual-use technologies here, but we've got to enjoy the memes, because aside from that, there's a lot of things to worry about.
Fantastic. And when they get too funny and you get distracted and you're going down the rabbit hole, you can use freedom.
Absolutely. Yeah. I definitely took TikTok off my phone after doing it for research purposes, because I was wasting my time. And if I had freedom, I'm sure I would have taken it off sooner.
Oh, Henry, thank you so much. This has been amazing. I've really loved chatting to you. I hope it's the first of many conversations over the coming years. I think what you're doing is amazing. Thank you so much. And,
thank you so much for having me on.
Stay in touch.
It's been great fun. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Freedom Matters. If you like what you hear, then subscribe on your favourite platform. And until next time, we wish you happy, healthy, and productive days.